Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to, I looked this up recently, episode 80 of the Film Realist podcast. I am the host, Kyle Naranya. On this week's episode, I will be reviewing Kung Fu Panda 4. It is very rare for a family-friendly franchise to reach 4 installments, and that is the case with Kung Fu Panda. Fingers crossed it is able to maintain the momentum of the 3 previous installments. As always, there will be a non-spoiler review and a spoiler, so if you have not yet had a chance to see the film, you don't have to worry. I will give you a general opinion that won't spoil anything in the film. Timecodes will be listed in the description, so let's get started with the non-spoiler section of my review of Kung Fu Panda 4.
It is time to take the next step on your journey.
I'm not going to be the Dragon Warrior anymore?
Just before getting into my review of Kung Fu Panda 4, I think it should be on the record how I feel about the previous 3, because that did affect my viewing experience of Kung Fu Panda 4. I love this trilogy. In general, taking Western elements and kind of mixing them with North American filmmaking values is a really interesting thing, not being disrespectful of the material. A great example of that is, ironically, the original animated series for both of Legend of Korra and Avatar: The Last Airbender. I really like the films. One of the key elements that I think goes really undervalued in those films in particular is the orchestral score from Hans Zimmer and John Powell. It's a phenomenal union of using Asian instruments while blending with a really cinematic and epic score for this panda that's performing kung fu. The action sequences have always been spectacular, and visuals alone aren't going to work necessarily in a kids film, but in general, that's been done really, really well over the trilogy of films, now becoming a tetralogy, apparently not a quadrilogy. Look at that, you learn something new every day. Although I might have brought that up on last week's episode. I'm not sure. I was returning. I was recovering from a gastro bug. That doesn't matter. We're here reviewing Kung Fu Panda 4. I took my son to see this. This was Sawyer's first film in the theater. He'd seen movies before in the drive-in, but this was the first time I'd seen a movie with him in the theater. So we both had our popcorn and we were excited for this. And ultimately, as is the case with most film franchises that run more than 3 installments, I don't think that Kung Fu Panda 4 reaches the levels of the previous 3. There's a lot of elements why they might get compiled into a list at some point, but free-flowing as with most of my reviews, one being the story is very simple. And I know there's going to be criticism towards me in that children's films in general are more simplistic, and I would counter that with the previous films, and in particular, it not being overly simplified as to where the entire story was predictable within about the first 10 minutes. I will get into non-spoilers, but ultimately, I don't think this film manages to present anything new, or at least use the message in a unique fashion that we haven't seen before. It felt very recycled, which obviously I'm in favor of when it comes to making the world a more ecological and friendlier place. Doesn't really work in kids' films, and unfortunately, because of that, it leads, and the simplistic nature of the story also, in my opinion, kind of leads to my major issues with this as well, which is the ensemble for this film doesn't really work. The film's budget was $85 million, which I believe was lower. Yes, about half. So 145 for the previous installment, and some of that is to do with the cast who's not present. The main focus of this story are different characters than we have had focus with in the 3 previous installments. And unfortunately, because that is the case, the film with a more simplistic story, as I've mentioned, feels a lot more, I don't want to use the word simple as a negative, because sometimes it can be effectively done where you are taking a simplistic story, but the fashion in which it's presented makes it feel like a unique take, something that Lord and Miller and any of the projects that they've been involved with have presented with before. That's just off the top of my head. And this film, while directed really well and has the cinematic nature and the action sequences in particular in this film are up to the par of the previous installments, but because Poe is the main focus and the ensemble being as minimal as it is, I don't think the film is as entertaining, in particular because one of the elements that I think worked particularly well in the trilogy was having Poe play off other characters, and that dynamic in them being very different, particularly with the Fearsome Five, does not have a counterpart in this film, and because of that, I don't think Poe is as humorous as he has been in the past. Jack Black, as always, is phenomenal as this character, but what works so well with Jack Black's roles is who he bounces off of, whether that is not in a film I necessarily loved, but as Bowser in the Super Mario Bros. Movie, go back to School of Rock, anytime you have somebody to the level of energy and comedic timing as Jack Black, you need really well executed straight characters, not in terms of sexual preference, but in terms of comedic performances. You need the person that the jokes are bouncing off of, or in some instances making fun of. And that leads to me to a criticism, which is that I think having more of a focus on other characters could probably work to some degree, but this comes down to a casting problem that I've had more recently, which is I like Awkwafina as a comedian. However, I think she's getting, it's ironic given the fact that she was just in a film, Migration, about birds migrating, but almost pigeonholed or put in a box with, well, we need Awkwafina to do the Awkwafina thing. And unfortunately, because she's done that so frequently, particularly in a lot of animated projects, whether that's Migration, Raya and the Last Dragon, Scuttle in the live action remake of The Little Mermaid, as well as she was in something else that I can't remember recently. Well, she was live action. Oh, she was also in Angry Birds, but she was also in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, that they don't allow her the opportunity to play a unique character. It's Awkwafina and that's it. And I think she's a more talented actress than the film gives her the opportunity to do. She was really great in Quiz Lady. Heck, she was more fun in Renfield, if I'm being more particular. But ultimately, I think that it just being a two-hander between Poe and, I don't even remember her name, Jen, doesn't really work. The villain of the film, I think, is quite entertaining. Viola Davis as the chameleon was a much more interesting villain than I think I would have suspected, given how typically when these films are recorded, it's likely with scratch audio. If you don't know what that means, is it's recorded with some other voice talent and then the A-list or S-list Hollywood star is brought in later. The visuals, again, this being a animated children's film, are incredible when it comes to the chameleon's ability to mimic other characters' powers. But at the same time, one of the elements that's brought up in the trailers that I think is an unfinished conclusion is that we do get to see previous villains. We do get to see Tai Lung, but ultimately we don't get anything more interesting with those characters as opposed to them just being present as Easter eggs minimally from what we had seen in the previous three. This doesn't feel like the culmination of the other events, unlike Toy Story 4, which I think provided what I believe was quoted by Molly Freeman, friend of the show, in Screen Rant's review, which was an epilogue to Woody's story, while not successfully managing to tell conclusions, I think, for the other toy, Bonnie's or Andy's toys. But in this, it's just more story. And ultimately, that hurts the film most, in where the story that it's trying to tell could be a really interesting piece in more. However, because it feels very reminiscent of something we've seen before and doesn't have a firm conclusion, it just feels like incomplete setup. And unfortunately, I don't think the setup is as interesting because of the elements that this film introduced that are new from the previous trilogy. If we are going to get more, quite frankly, I don't want the pivot that it does have. I thought the conclusion to Poe's character at the end of Kung Fu Panda 3 was resolution enough from where he started in Kung Fu Panda 1. His overall arc was phenomenal, where we get Poe being the Dragon Warrior into Kung Fu Panda 2, him really learning to become the legend of the Dragon Warrior, and then ultimately in 3 being the master and becoming the spiritual leader for the Valley of Peace. It's a phenomenal 3-act story, and it was a phenomenal conclusion. And as I mentioned, Kung Fu Panda 4, while fun, feels like the diet version of those previous films and is just more for the sake of more. I feel that DreamWorks is in this state of we don't have another franchise to really be pushing out. We have a Shrek 5 coming out, as well as other franchises that they've worked on. A live action How to Train Your Dragon is coming. I'm not necessarily sure Shrek 5, I'm not sure, or Bad Guys 2 probably, but they're in this state of continuance, and unfortunately I think the rush to do so and the potentially budgetary limits that the film had lead this to just being another installment as opposed to something special like the 3 previous installments. If you want something that is better than the average children's film, I would say this is good enough for that. But ultimately, I know I've used that word a lot, but I wanted to really love this, and unfortunately, my hesitation with what the marketing materials were leading me to feel this may be were presented in the full 90 minutes that the story is, and more is not necessarily a feeling I want to have leaving the movie theater. So it's a soft recommendation. It's not something I'm excited about. I don't feel that this is going to stand the test of time as perhaps the original does. And in the 4 of them, I probably would say that this is the weakest in my opinion. I would rank the Kung Fu Pandas as Kung Fu Panda 1, Kung Fu Panda 3, 2, and then, no, I lied. I would rank the Kung Fu Pandas as 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is ironic, but at the same time, I think the other installments managed to do something special, while this just managed to be another installment, which is unfortunate. I can kind of explain more of this in the spoilers, so I'm going to do that now. So if you don't want to be spoiled, you can skip the spoiler section of the review, and you can jump to the outro featuring question of the week and find out what is coming out next week.
How should we do this? Quick and painless? Or slow and painful?
I think that sound clip is the best place to start off when talking about Kung Fu Panda 4, and so we are in full-blown spoilers. So the Furious 5 just aren't in the movie, and the reason I brought up the budget standpoint of the 2 previous films is Kung Fu Panda 3 was $145 million, and this film being $85. Now, I don't necessarily think casting is $60 million, but some of it probably is. And in just this, as I mentioned, just having it be Poe and Shen, Aquafina's Fox character, who is a thief and with potentially a heart of gold. And you can see where I'm going with this, which is in the very first sound clip you would have heard transitioning to the non-spoiler section of the review. Poe is no longer to be the Dragon Warrior and as the master of peace or spiritual leader of the Valley of Peace. It is his job now to pick the next Dragon Warrior. As a bullet point story continuation, I actually think that this is a phenomenal place to jump off with Poe. While he may not necessarily have embraced that role given where he ends at the ending of Kung Fu Panda 3, it is a really interesting thing to explore this character who is obsessed with the fight, somebody who was not a part of it and dreamed of being a member of the Furious 5, and look how far he's come. But we don't really get any of that reflection, partially because the Furious 5 aren't there. We don't have any of that nostalgia outside of his 2 dads, which is something I really like that this film pushes even more forward. While they are not an actual couple, but having 2 platonic fathers for Poe is an element that I would consider to be some representation, regardless of the fact that the 2 of them are not LGBTQ twin spirit. I think that's really cool. And having Po and Shen just bounce off of each other, she is immediately introduced in the story where Po cannot decide who is going to be the next dragon warrior. And because the building blocks of the story are so abundantly obvious, I found myself immediately disinterested because it was so abundantly clear. The metaphor for the first Kung Fu Panda, where there is no special ingredient, feels much more gratifying because we are learning it with Po as the story progresses. Kofi Outlaw of the show, I know, is a huge fan of that script, and I believe actually taught it when he was teaching writing in New York, or screenplay writing. Screenwriting. I don't know why I'm struggling with that sentence. And this film fails to introduce more characters and create a fulfilling ensemble without having the Furious 5 present and it being separate adventures where we have both of, what are the names? I don't actually know what their names are. Mr. Ping and Lee, so Bryan Cranston and James Hong, being on their own little adventure trying to take care of Po, which at this point, this guy has become a spiritual master of the realm. Feels like something that should have been earlier, but because they introduced the pandas when they did, it doesn't really work, for my opinion. It is funny to see Po's dad struggling with confidence, which is something that Po clearly had struggled with earlier, but just for comedic purposes, I don't think it really works. It's fun at times, and quite frankly, the thing I left the film most thinking was that James Hong is criminally underrated, and I'm really glad that he got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, because the fact that he's been in, I believe, over 80 screen credits is absolutely amazing, and him as that Mr. Ping character is phenomenal, and I love that relationship that he has, in particular with Po being the guy who actually raised him. But at the same time, and this is a criticism and something I'm really nervous for, is that Ke Huy Quan, who won an Oscar and was phenomenal in Everywhere, All at Once, didn't really have any projects lined up, and that was just an example of the issues that Hollywood has with representation, in the fact that this guy didn't have a bunch of projects lined up to be in after. He was fortunately as cast in Loki and played Obi phenomenally, and then in this, it feels like stunt casting. Han is in a couple of scenes. He is what I believe some sort of, so he's a pangolin, which is similar to that of an armadillo. He doesn't really have a character. He is antagonistic at times to Zhen and Po, but there's no real resolution to that character. It's exciting to see Ke Huy Quan got cast in something else, but again, I don't want to use this word, but it felt like just token Ke Huy Quan. Look, we have him. And so he can be in the press, and how fun is it that he gets to be in junkets, which I'm not honestly sure if he did or not, outside of the fact that I know he's in this and I think he was at the premiere, but any of the marketing for this it's all Jack Black and Awkwafina, which is fine. And then Ronnie Cheng shows up again. His character is quite funny, him being a fish living in the mouth of a pelican who he calls his mom. Again, the parentage of these animals being raised by different species is quite humorous at times, but introducing this redemption arc so early into the story where we meet Shen, and she is ultimately, it's a liar reveal where she is working for the chameleon who wanted to learn kung fu but never could because she was small. That narrative doesn't work for me because we had Cricket, I believe it's Cricket, as one of the masters of kung fu. Is it a cricket? Mantis. I should know that. I'm very tired. Sorry. Mantis in the previous 3 films, one of the Furious 5 was a bug. So the fact that a chameleon couldn't become a good kung fu master, it just feels lazy. And unfortunately, because you don't give the villain a compelling story in that regard, I didn't really care. Viola Davis, of course, is phenomenal. That goes without saying. But the character's gimmick is the only thing that's really interesting about the character. The chameleon having the ability to absorb the other kung fu styles of all the different animals is really cool, and could have built to something really entertaining where Po has to go up against all the other villains he's faced before, but because the movie's budget is only $80 million, and we could only bring back Ian McShane, we couldn't bring back Bryan Cranston, not Bryan Cranston, we couldn't bring back J.K. Simmons or Gary Oldman. They just sort of are there. And we get an interesting chimera monster, but I think it would have been much more interesting to have those characters come back and use them at Poe to force him to think maybe he hasn't had the character growth that he has. Have that character question himself, and this is one of the elements that could be potentially preventing Poe from moving on to the next stage and being the Master Oogway for the Valley of Peace, joining Master Shifu on the next stage of their development. But no, we just have a chameleon with sorcerer powers, and ultimately the action is cool, but it's just, look, we got Ian McShane back, and then you get to see these other characters, some of which have been referenced in the past, which was cool. So if you're looking for fun Easter eggs in the Kung Fu Panda franchise, you'll see them there. But the liar reveal twist, where we find out that Zhen was working for Chameleon all along, is baked into the beginning, and you can kind of see it coming. Why would you trust this character who is a thief and in it for herself? And I know that Poe is this kind of person, or kind of bear, panda bear. It just feels simplistic, and unfortunately I found that to be less intriguing, and I felt myself less invested because everything felt so rudimentary and recycled, as I mentioned in the past. The visuals are absolutely incredible. The morphing to the familiar animals we have seen before was really cool, but I honestly don't think we've seen anything different from Poe. It's unfortunate because a movie like this has been done before, and much more successfully with something like Cars 3. Cars 3, in my opinion, is what Kung Fu Panda 4 wanted it to be, which was that film starts off with Lightning McQueen wanting to be the best, but realizing that he is over the hill and that it's his trainer's time to become the next great racer. And the pivot in this film is in the very end, and quite frankly, doesn't really work because it turns out that Poe just wanted Zhen to overcome the chameleon when he could have done it. So it puts Poe in an interesting space where, yes, he's grown to where he can now pick the next person, but ultimately he just chose not to overcome the challenges he was facing when it came to the chameleon and only let Zhen do it, which is interesting to some degree, where the character wants to be out of the battle because that's what Master Oogway wanted for him. But it's a mixed message all the way through, and unfortunately, it just didn't work for me. As somebody, as I mentioned in the non-spoilers, holds these films in such high regard, I was disappointed that where we leave this, where he's the next spiritual leader, or whatever Master Oogway was of the Valley of Peace, the Furious Five are back in non-speaking roles to train Zhen as the Dragon Warrior. Just feels like setup for a 5 and 6, and it's not setup I'm really excited about, which I'm disappointed for. So that will do it for my non-spoilers, or no, this is spoilers, my spoiler section of the review. Let's jump into question of the week and find out what is coming up on next week's episode. All right, this week's question of the week was, what do you think is the best book-to-film adaptation? Jermaine Jones wrote in, Forrest Gump is the answer to this week's question. Now, it's funny because I heard from a listener, hi Jillian, that this was too broad a question, which for me was the fun, because when I thought of the question, my answer was immediate, and I'll tell you once I get through all the listeners' answers. But because clearly book to film adaptation is probably the thing that's been happening the longest, I thought it would be the most fun to explore. So that's why it was the question of the week. The next answer came from Stephanie. A Christmas Carol is a classic, but the Muppet version is the best. That's how my wife feels as well. Gone Girl was also pretty accurate to the screen. That is true. Scotty Cameron wrote in, straight to novel film adaptation, it is either Silence of the Lambs or Return of the King. I would also nominate Watchmen as the best film adaptation of a graphic novel. I do love both of those films, that being Silence of the Lambs and Watchmen. And then Nalina Heisey wrote in The Secret of Nim, which is a book that I don't think is as popular, quite frankly, as the book, which isn't even called The Secret of Nim. My answer to this when I came up with it was The Prince of Egypt. The Bible, the Christian one, that may be an oxymoron, being one of the oldest books of all time, and The Prince of Egypt being one of my favorite animated films of all time, managing to tell a story that is 2,000 years old, if not more, is something I think is no small feat, given the fact that there were a substantial amount of hurdles that film had to do in order to make sure that it was accurate to the different religions that are involved with the Moses story. So that was my answer. If you didn't get a chance to answer, I'm sorry for you, but the question for this, very sorry. The question for next week's episode of the podcast is, what is the most underrated kids franchise? So in terms of films, what is the most underrated kids movie franchise? There's a lot, obviously the Pixar ones are held up very high, but what do you think is the most underrated when it comes to films aimed at children and families? So that's the question. You will be able to hear it on next week's episode of the podcast. And next week's episode of the podcast, I will be reviewing the start of Invincible Season 2 Part 2. So that technically comes out on Thursday. If anything else comes out news-wise, I know I haven't covered stuff like the Superman has an S or whatever, or some of the castings. If it's just me on the show, I don't think that conversation, well, obviously I know it's just me, wouldn't be necessarily interesting, and I don't have much to say about it. So that's why I didn't mention those things. I think the S is cool, it being Kingdom Come. Oh, look, I'm doing it already. Anyways, next week's episode of the podcast will be a review or just reaction to the return of Invincible on Amazon Prime. And that's probably it. And then as we get into the upcoming weeks, there will be Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, Godzilla X Kong New Empire. One of those I'm looking forward to. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know which one. My name is Kyle Naranya. I am the Film Realist. I hope you enjoyed being one yourself, and I hope to see you next time.